I'd like to stay with the topic of vulnerability just a little bit longer, but to stop it being too monotonous, I'd like to take it in, I'd like to try to take it in an unfamiliar direction, a direction that we don't usually associate with the whole idea of being vulnerable. So the first point that I'd like to make has to do with defending ourselves. Generally speaking, defending ourselves is quite a legitimate thing to do. If somebody comes at you, you're quite within your rights to defend yourself, I'd say. You could, you'd be within your rights to repel them without inflicting too much damage on them, hopefully. You'd be within your rights to do a couple of years training in mixed martial arts, maybe, so that when that eventuality happens, you will be able to defend yourself quite readily. All of that kind of stuff is fine, but I'm not talking about physical self-defense. I'm talking about defending ourselves against psychological distress or psychological pain, mental pain. I'm not quite sure what to call it. The stuff that happens that doesn't feel good. And in this case, we can say quite categorically that defending ourselves, blocking the blow that's coming our way, is not a good idea. It's not a good idea because it creates extra suffering for ourselves, and presumably the point is that we don't want to create extra suffering for ourselves. So defending ourselves against mental or emotional pain is not so smart. It's a reflex, the same as any other reflex. But reflexes aren't necessarily smart. If something comes at you and you put your hand up to ward it off, that's a good reflex. But what Freud calls the neurotic reflex of defending ourselves against pain, not so good. So when there's emotional pain, it's good to bring consciousness to bear, actual awareness, as in what's going on here, let's have a look at it, instead of pure mechanical reacting. So that's definitely a good thing to do. We can look at why defending ourselves or promoting ourselves, which is the same thing, even though it may not look like it, isn't a good idea, or rather it's an idea that leads to extra suffering in our lives, just in case we wanted extra suffering in our lives. And maybe on some level we do. So I'm trying not to say it's good or it's bad, it's just a thing that brings suffering, more suffering than we had before. The reason it does this is because there's something happens when I defend myself that I never focus on. I can't really focus on it. I can't really see it at all. So earlier I was talking about it being a counterintuitive idea not to try and increase our invulnerability and decrease our vulnerability. But really, what I'm talking about here, it isn't so much counterintuitive. It's actually a mental blind spot. We cannot see it for the life of us. Someone could come along and keep pointing it out and saying, hey, there it is, look. And we still wouldn't see it because we've got a mental blind spot. Talking isn't any good. But what this mental blind spot is all about is what happens when we do defend ourselves. Because when we defend ourselves, it's always an idea of ourselves that we are defending. So as soon as I defend myself, I'm assuming a self. I'm assuming a mental image. I'm assuming that this idea of who I am is who I am. And then there's this thing that happens where all my attention goes on to the business of defending myself. And none of my attention goes into what it is, this idea that I'm defending, which is the idea of myself. So basically, if I'm not defending myself and I'm not promoting myself, I don't actually crystallize or form this idea of myself. There's no need for it. It's not a necessary thing to have an idea of oneself or a definition of oneself or a concrete kind of a nucleus of this is me, as opposed to that isn't me, or that's somebody else, or that's something else. It's not necessary, and doesn't come naturally for us to act out of a concretized, congealed nucleus of selfhood or egohood. That only happens when we're panicked, so to speak, or when we're triggered in some way. And absolutely every time I'm triggered into defending myself, I create an idea of myself that I cannot examine and that I am committed to defending to the bitter end. So that's the trap, that's the problem. The problem isn't the defending so much, the problem is the fact that I have automatically identified with this self that isn't me and I can never question. And that's a suffering producing kind of a thing, really, because it's a suffering producing kind of a scenario because, number one, this idea has got nothing to do with me whatsoever. It's got nothing to, I won't say, well, I have said, but I won't say it has nothing to do with me, because me is the mind created idea. It has nothing to do with my nature or who I really am. Nothing, absolutely nothing to do with that at all. It's an arbitrary point that I have now locked onto and have to defend. So that's the first thing about it. And the second thing about it is it can't be defended, because part of defending it means championing its existence, which is to say, saying that it's real. So that's no good right from the start, because it isn't real. It isn't who I am, and it isn't real either. It's a double whammy. So to get locked into this position of either defending or promoting, because it comes to the same thing, is a road that heads to absolute disaster. Well, it heads to disaster upon the terms which I've assumed to be the terms which are actually real. In bigger terms, it isn't a disaster, it isn't anything like that. But because I've locked on to saying that this self is who I am and has to be championed and promoted and preserved in perpetuity forever, that's the suffering right there, because it's a doomed task. It's a task that absolutely cannot be succeeded at, and it's a task that I have implicitly said must be succeeded at. Defeat is not an option, failure is not an option. So when we say that, that is our stupidity right there. It's all very well saying failure isn't an option, but suppose the endeavour that we have embarked upon is an absurd endeavour, a nonsensical endeavour. It just doesn't even make sense. And here's us bigging ourselves up and saying failure is not an option. How stupid is that? Failure has to be an option. Failure is the only option. There is no option. And yet failure isn't as bad as all that, really. It only seems like a bad thing when we're totally committed to succeeding at the absurd task, which isn't a task because it can't be ever succeeded at. So really this is at the heart of our suffering. And in mental health we often come across the notion that letting go is a good thing. Just let go, stop micromanaging, stop obsessing, stop being anxious about trying to get things to be the way we want them to be. And what this comes down to is no longer being committed to the impossible struggle of getting this idea of ourselves to work to work out for us, because it won't. And it shouldn't do either. Even if it could work out, that would be a terrible thing, because how terrible would it be for us to actually manage to create a false and limited idea of ourselves that actually works for us and never doesn't work, because it's when it doesn't work that the self-construct, um, that's where the freedom from the self-construct lies. As your man says, it's through the cracks that the light comes through. Whatever his name is, the guy who wrote the song. So this is a counterintuitive idea, because our naive kind of reflex thought on the matter is, when there's no cracks, that's the great thing. When there's a massive edifice that can't ever be broken and won't ever crack up, that's the great thing. So that's the kind of dumb reflex way of looking at life. Leonard Cohen's the guy, isn't it? So what Leonard Cohen's saying is, actually no, it's when that edifice cracks and falls to pieces. That's the great thing, because where the little crack is, you can see the light coming out. You didn't even know there was such a thing as light. We didn't know that because we were so used to living in darkness that we thought the darkness was light, or we thought the darkness was okay, or we thought there was nothing else but darkness anyway. So once we see the light, it throws everything into perspective, and we realize, hey, the darkness is darkness. It's the absence of light. There is something else apart from darkness, and darkness isn't the be all and the end all. It isn't everything. So even a little bit of a crack can let a little bit of light through, and even a little bit of light can turn our way of seeing everything on its head, and we suddenly understand that there is such a thing as freedom, and we suddenly understand that we've been living in a modality of existence in which freedom didn't really exist, not genuine freedom, because genuine freedom means freedom from this false and limited idea of ourselves that we've seized upon, because we got panicked into seizing upon it and thinking that we have to defend it no matter what, to the bitter end. And it is to the bitter end, because there is always going to be an end, because we can't defend it, because it's indefensible. And that end is bitter, because it's the very, very, very last thing we want. It's our number one catastrophe, the catastrophe of all catastrophes, that we find out that this false limited idea of ourselves that we can't defend, actually, no, we can't defend it. And we get to the point where we just have to realize that we can't defend it, and it can't be defended. And then that is our suffering, to be in that predicament. Yet oddly enough, the suffering is also a good thing, as we can see within the context of just talking about it. If we're actually in the throes of it, it's a different matter, because there's not much clarity there. But when we're talking about it, having a conversation about it, we can say, yes, of course it's a good thing. That's what marks the end of the illusion that I am attached to. Being detached or disidentified with it happens against my will, because I don't believe that there is anything else apart from the illusion. And I don't believe it's an illusion, but I don't think there's anything else either. I don't think there's such a thing as a truth, because when I'm identified with the illusion, I can't, the actual truth of the illusion being an illusion doesn't exist. It doesn't make any sense to me. It can't exist to me. And yet this truth of the illusion being illusion is anything that can save me. So that's why I fight against it. Because instead of seeing it as the truth, or instead of seeing it as reality, might be a better way of putting it, I see it as the ultimate of all catastrophes. A thing so bad I cannot even bring myself to think about it, because even if I start to come close to thinking about it, I'm so terrified, because I'm starting to get a whiff of what's actually happening. I'm starting to get a smell, a sense of what this is actually all about. And everything in me recoils from that because it spells the doom of the self-construct. So all of that comes from defending ourselves against emotional pain or against insecurity or against fear. It doesn't matter what we defend ourselves against. That's what happens. We're defending ourselves in order to create a state of non-vulnerability, of invulnerability, because that seems like a good thing to us. That's the edifice with no cracks in it. It's a massive, huge structure that's made out of reinforced concrete. It's made out of, God knows what it's made out of. It's made out of the strongest, most reliable substance in the universe. That's what we're trying to create for ourselves. But there isn't any such substance. There's no substance anywhere, really. Ultimately, all substance resolves into emptiness, as physics shows. As the Buddhists say, emptiness is behind everything. So we'd like to have something which isn't emptiness, which is pure solidity to defend ourselves against the bad stuff. But there is no such thing. But we continue to believe that there is. So the situation of being vulnerable is, of course, the situation of not defending ourselves and also not promoting ourselves, not being triggered into defending or promoting, not being triggered into asserting the self, which is what we're essentially doing, asserting this self. And we can only assert a definite thing, definite idea. And all definite ideas are creations of thought. They are thought. So here we are asserting thought as if that's a good thing. Thought seems to be a solid, real thing, but it isn't. It's just an arbitrary illusion that we create by remaining ignorant to the bigger picture. Because when we don't remain ignorant to the bigger picture, the thought-created reality shows itself to be full of cracks. It's one big crack. Everything's one big crack, really. And what that leads on to is another way of looking at vulnerability. So instead of saying vulnerability is where we're not defending, we can also say that vulnerability is when there is nothing there to defend, or when we see that there's nothing there to defend. So when we're vulnerable, we're actually not identifying with an ego construct. We're not identifying with a particular point on the graph, saying this point is me. We're not staking our claim on a particular possibility or a particular manifestation of how things are, saying this is it. I'm putting my flag here. This is me. We're not bothering to do that. Because to do that, no matter that it sounds like a positive act and saying, yes, I'm claiming this spot as me or as my identity, to do that, even though it seems positive to us, is actually rejecting everything else we are. So to assert definitely what we are creates a false idea of what we are. All ideas of what we are false. But what we're really doing is closing the door against all of the other possibilities, which are also what we are, who we are. Because who we are isn't a closed door, it isn't a limited thing. There's no advantage to be had from doing that thing where we assert, where we identify. Identification in that way, in that sense of the word, is death. Identification is death. It's the end of all our possibilities of who we truly are. And some wretched, meager existence is who we aren't anyway, and never could be, and yet are obliged to defend and promote to the bitter end, as I keep on saying. So vulnerability is another word for not having this concretized sense of identity. So it's not like there's a person, there's a self there, an ego there that is vulnerable. I'm a self. I'm a vulnerable self. Here. I am a self being vulnerable. Careful! I don't want anyone to bang into me because that might hurt. But here I am being a self being vulnerable. That isn't how it works. That doesn't make any sense at all, because the self, the ego construct, is pure 100% invulnerability. It's hallucinatory invulnerability, because there's no such thing as invulnerability, but it's, to us, it's invulnerability. So what is vulnerability, which isn't a hallucination, is no self that's being asserted. There's no need to do that. There's no need to say I am this. There's no need at all. So when we don't say it, we are vulnerable. But the word vulnerable takes on more of a significance when we look at it like that, because it really means I'm not closed off. I'm not identified with a false idea of myself. And it also means being aware or being conscious. Consciousness equals vulnerability, in other words. How can we be conscious if we're not vulnerable? And which is not to say that I am asserting my consciousness. I am conscious, because there, again, in that asserting, there is the ego construct asserting that it's conscious, which it can never be, because consciousness only comes, just like happiness or freedom only ever comes when we don't assert, when we don't fall into the trap of asserting this definite identity, which we are given to understand is such a great thing, and that we should be celebrating endlessly. Okay, thanks for watching.